So I'm Becca Jablonski, and I'm a professor in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics. And Erin Love is a research scientist in our department as well. So we do a lot of work that does essentially benchmarking around farms and ranches that sell through alternative markets. And so we haven't done as much with wheat, to be really transparent about that. And partially, as you all know, it's really an emerging subsector of wheat growers that are selling through these alternative markets. So we don't have very long today. We have a lot of data on the benchmarking space for alternative markets. But I'm going to present some of the very preliminary work we've been doing on wheat, on alternative wheat markets. And we would be really interested in doing a lot more in this space. So I would love to chat more with any of you that are interested. So just because, of course, I have to start with this as an academic, the data that we use is from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Resource Management Survey data. For any of you farmers that are on the call right now, you might actually have filled this out, and so thank you very much for doing this. This is the best source of farm financial data that we have across the entire United States. It samples about 30,000 farms annually, and so we end up with a sample size of about 17,000 operations. And then this data set started asking questions about participation in local food markets in 2008. So we actually have a pretty good sample size now for local food production and local food markets. Now, one challenge for us is that the focus is in the core agricultural states. This is congressionally mandated, which is not where most local food sales occur. And so we do our best, but the local food, we still don't have great geographic representation, right? As you can imagine, California is the only core ag state where we also have a significant amount of local food sales. We also have a very small sample of wheat growers selling through local food markets. So I do want to give a big caveat to the data from that perspective. And then the other thing I want to mention here is that the way that this data set is set up, it's supposed to be weighted so that it matches the US population of farms, but it's not weighted for local food producers, right? And so we can weight the non-local sample, but we can't weight the local sample to be representative. So here's some sort of overall data you can see. The interesting thing to note is that within our local wheat grower sample, they actually are larger in scale and have a significantly larger total dollar amount that they're spending in variable expenses, right? So this isn't including fixed, this is just variable expenses. But you can see that even though those local wheat growers have larger variable expenses, they have a smaller amount of proprietor income, right? So this is actually the money that essentially goes back to the owner operator, right? And you'll see here when I break this down in a second, it's really, we think, because there are substantial additional costs associated with getting that product to market, right? Taking on all of those additional supply chain functions, doing more of that marketing, processing, and distribution. And so we find that this is the case across all types of commodities, not just wheat. The other thing I want to point out is that it appears that our wheat growers without local food sales, so those that are using more commodity-oriented channels, appear more likely to be diversified with livestock, right? So that they're taking on livestock production as part of their portfolio. So here is the breakdown of expenditure as a percent of total variable expense, right? So this is percentage. We're not giving you total dollar values here. And so the green bar at the top is exactly what I mentioned earlier, right? This is proprietor income. And so you can see that a larger portion of total expense for those non-local wheat growers, that bar on the left, is going back to the proprietor. And you can see that in the blue box, so if we look at this right here, this is about livestock, right, expenses, and you can see that there are none on the right side. You can see for both of the local operators and non-local operators, they have 3% of their total variable expenses on utilities. There's no machine hire and custom that we see on the right side for the local producers, but about 5% for non-local. But the area where I really wanted to draw some attention is in this labor. And now we see that 7% of the non-local wheat growers' labor expenditure of their total expenditure is spent on labor. compared to 10% for the local operators. And so this is in line with what we see across commodities, that actually participating in local food markets takes more labor as a share of total variable expense. And actually, when I break this out for other commodities, which I couldn't do here because of the small sample of local wheat growers, what we see is that as farms and ranches that sell through local food markets get larger, they spend a significantly larger share of their total variable expenses on labor, even once they're over $1 million in gross cash farm income. So this is the opposite story that we see for traditional sort of conventional ag. What we see is that as traditional conventional ag gets larger, they devote a smaller and smaller share of their total variable expense to labor because they substitute capital, right? They buy more tractors, they get more mechanized, they're able to be more efficient in a traditional sense, but that isn't true in these local operations. And I think that's really worth noting here. We see that over half of the variable expenses for these local wheat growers are devoted to fertilizer, right? Which I think is really interesting. And we actually, I don't know if Bob wants to mention something about that, but I found that to be very interesting. And so I think with that, I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Erin Love right now.
Thanks, Becca. Actually see your presenter view. Is there any way you could put just the current slide up for display? Or I can share too, if that's easier. Awesome, thank you. All right, so I am going to talk a little bit about what happens with pricing after wheat leaves the farm gate. And I'll talk a little bit about a few different supply chains. So I just want to introduce the agents that we're talking about first. This will be familiar to many of you, I'm sure. But essentially, wheat growers are the beginning of the supply chain. And then the grain leaves the farm and is stored in elevators, or perhaps is stored on farm in elevators. And then the elevators will sell that grain to mills, who then mill the wheat into flour. And then if the flour is the end product that consumers are purchasing, it will be sold to them at that point, perhaps through a distributor. And then there's also the possibility that the flour will be turned into a further processed baked good, such as a loaf of bread. And so if that's the case, then the flour will go through a baker or a bakehouse, and then that bakehouse will sell the product, again, perhaps through a distributor, which would be common in a commodity supply chain. So Becca and I are involved in a project called the FAR project, and we're modeling the Colorado food system. And we're looking at some key commodities, wheat being one of them. And for that project, we have decided to narrow our scope to focus on a few key products. So we are looking at flour and whole grain bread. And then if you could hit enter, Becca, please. There are a few other ways we're differentiating the products that we're focusing on. We are looking at different types of grains that are grown and different management practices. So for our baseline product, we're looking at hard red winter wheat, HRW for short, and we're looking at both conventionally grown and organically grown hard red winter wheat. And then for a different variety, we have chosen to look at snowmass wheat that is conventionally grown, and snowmass is a white whole wheat. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have been collecting price data, as I mentioned, for this project, and we have collected these data from a variety of sources. We've used the USDA Economic Research Service Wheat Yearbook. We've pulled from articles. We've taken price data from retail outlets and public school purchasing records. And we've also made extensive use of a technique called margining, which I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A session if people are interested. But we have essentially cobbled together prices for points all along the supply chain, which is tricky given that a lot of price data is proprietary. But we think these are pretty good ballpark estimates of different products with different characteristics all along the supply chain. So I'm just going to share some of the price data that we found in hopes that no matter where you work on the supply chain, that it may be interesting to tell, if you are thinking of experimenting with a new variety or a new growing practice. These are some of the price premium that you might expect to see for different products. So we can see at the farm gate, when wheat is sold to the elevator, that hard red winter conventionally grown wheat is about 8 cents per pound. All of the prices listed here will be in dollars per pound. And then the organic wheat is about 13 cents per pound. And the snowmass conventionally grown wheat is about 10 cents per pound. And I'm not going to read off all the prices for every single step. I'll post them and you all can take a look. But I do want to point out that this pattern generally holds along the supply chain, with hard red winter conventionally grown wheat being the cheapest, the organically grown wheat being the most expensive, and then the conventionally grown specialty variety snowmass falling somewhere in the middle of those two. So if you hit enter again, please, we see that prices generally double at the elevator step. And we think this is mostly due to transportation costs. At the mill step, we see that prices, if you'll hit enter again, please, prices increase a little bit, but not much. And then at this point, if the flour is being turned into baked goods, we see, if you'll hit enter again, we see that bakers fetch somewhere in the 2 to 3 times range for what they paid for the flour product when they're selling their baked good to a distributor. And then finally, at the distribution step, we see that the margins that distributors collect are actually quite different for flour and bread. So we see that the flour step, the increase is substantial but small. But at the bread step, the margin that distributors collect is actually quite hefty. So I think I will leave it there at this point, and I will pass it off to Jordan.
Great. Let's see here. Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you. My name is Jordan Shockley. I'm an associate extension professor at the University of Kentucky. And a lot of my work is focused around specialty grain production and the economic costs associated with producing that. So I will briefly talk about a project we've been working here in Kentucky for about the past 2 years. So really, when we think about this, our goal here in Kentucky was to increase the share of Kentucky grains going to the local food and beverage industry. As many of you may know, Kentucky is the bourbon state, and there's a lot of boutique bourbons distilleries popping up here that are interested in locally sourcing specialty grain varieties to differentiate their product from some of our larger bourbon distillers in the state. So really what we first had to ask ourselves is what is the kind of the market demand for specialty grains in Kentucky? And I think it transfers to other states, including Colorado. And so what we were doing was conducted some interviews with millers, bakers, maltsters, brewers, and distillers to get a sense of what they were looking for from farmers as far as product goes. And through these interviews, we came up with basically 5 key themes that you see here. So the first one being opportunity, second one being quality, third one being storage, the fourth one being flavor, and the fifth one being relationships. So I'll go through each one of these quickly. As we all know, the local food movement has been increasing across the country. And so this provides great opportunities for farmers to get into some of these specialty grains and sell them directly to bakers, brewers, distillers. And from the previous presentation, you saw that first typical in a conventional setting, you're selling to an elevator. Well, this is more direct marketing to the end user in hopes of gaining a higher price for that product. And not only in Kentucky, but across the state, a lot of millers and maltsters are expanding. I know here in Kentucky, our brewing capacity has increased, which has provided the opportunity to grow some malting barley, for example. And an example of that, our first malt house opened in 2020. And we've also partnered with the James B. Bean Institute to do a lot of research as far as distilling goes here at the University of Kentucky. Quality is also important. And so when you think about growing these, doesn't matter what type of specialty grain you're growing, right? There is more stringent and less flexibility than commodity grains when it comes to quality. And so a lot of these quality specs begin with USDA #1 grade or food grade and adjust accordingly. You can see here the bottom right-hand side of my screen, some quality specs for malting barley. And so a lot of our quality labs, I'm not sure about there in Colorado, are out of state for our brewers and distillers. And so there's a cost associated with that. But when thinking about the pricing that was mentioned earlier, if you don't meet this quality spec, then those prices will decrease and potentially even be rejected, and a alternative market will be needed. Storage is also important when you think about selling to these local millers, bakers. So a lot of these places don't have large on-site storage capacity, and so a lot of the demand is for those farmers that have on-farm storage. And really, when you think about this, a lot of our producers are doing just-in-time delivery. So whether it's a miller or distiller, they want maybe a truckload and a half every day. And so when thinking about the economics, transportation is going to be a huge aspect of this. Aggregators do exist that will buy and store specialty grains. So that is an opportunity if you have a lack of storage on the farm, and something you might need to think about. For flavor, flavor profiles of grain varieties are very important. When thinking about variety selection, yields are important, but flavor seems to be more important when we think about going into the mills and to millers and bakers. As far as variety selection for distillers, alcohol yield is important to them as flavor for the other market channels. Relationships, I think this is key. Part of our project here in Kentucky was building the gap across the supply chain from farmers to end users. And what we found is these end users of our locally produced grains, they value these professional and interpersonal relationships with the farmers. It helps build this story and help brand products that links back to your state. And they're willing to work with farmers to ensure, fair compensation as well as risk mitigation. So a lot of these products do not have sort of risk management mechanisms like crop insurance that you can take advantage of. And they're also looking to build a long-term win-win relationship with farmers. So building that relationship, having those connections, and being able to provide a great product on both ends, where the producing and the end users, is what they're looking for. So when we talk about key economic consideration, 4 key concepts here: markets, prices, input cost, and yields are all important because we're hoping that farmers can grow some of these products and have a profitable operation. So some of the market considerations you need to think about. Again, identify which market segment suits your operation. What can you grow? What markets are close to reduce transportation costs? And what would you enjoy growing? Build that relationship with your buyer. invite the buyers to your farm, have that personal connection so that your buyers know where their inputs are being produced. Understand their needs. Again, our bakers and maltsters require a high quality product, but our distillers may not, because they're not as influenced on the flavor profile, but more so the alcohol yield. So understand their differences and what their needs are. And negotiate a payment structure with the buyer. We'll talk more about that here in a second. But really what we're looking at is direct marketing. And so for anyone that's interested in this and getting more information, we do have what's called a market ready program. You can see the website here on the screen that has a host of resources for directly marketing your product to millers, to brewers, to distillers, all of these end users that we're talking about today. Grain price consideration, again, some numbers were just thrown out, but I think there's various pricing structures that do exist that you need to be aware of. Unlike traditional commodity grains where you're selling to an elevator at some futures contract, yes, some of these specialty grains are linked to commodity markets directly, like our hard red winter wheat that was discussed. But there's other pricing structures out there for these products that are not linked directly to the futures market. And so one strategy and price structure is a premium over commodity markets. So let's just say a 25-cent premium per bushel over the hard red winter wheat futures price. There's also a set price per bushel or per pound that was discussed earlier, where you have an arrangement with the buyer to sell at a specific set price. And there's also really what we've experienced here is there's really not a set price. I think a lot of our end users know what they can pay up to, but what is fair on both ends for the grower and for the end user. And so some of our farmers here are basically negotiating a price where it equals your gross return of the best yielding conventional grain crop. So let's just, for example, if a farmer were to grow some heirloom corn variety on their ground, they would then ask for negotiate a gross return. So that would be just yield times price of their best conventional yielding grain crop on that ground, because basically it's the opportunity cost of taking that out of production. And so that's one strategy we've seen. But again, all of these are going to be tied to some sort of desired quality or spec, or if those are not met, those prices decrease significantly from what is offered. So some input cost considerations. Again, we're in Kentucky, we're still learning how to grow some of these specialty grains, but what we're seeing is fertility cost. Some of our hard red winter wheats are requiring more nitrogen. You can see, however, cereal rye is requiring less nitrogen, and our heirloom corn varieties that we're experimenting with are requiring less NP, NK in fertility cost. Our seeding cost depends on what we're looking at, small grains versus our heirloom corn varieties. We're seeing, half the seeding rate. So that goes back to spacing and having that opportunity there for some of these varieties to have the space needed to grow and therefore a reduced seeding rate.
And this is Sean just jumping in. We're down to our last minute, just as a timekeeper.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, pesticide cost, finding labeling or tillage may be required for weed control. I think one of the biggest things is machinery cost. If you're going to get into this, some of our modern planters aren't set up for the row spacings and plant densities, and then the trucking cost and storage costs that I spoke about. Real quick on on small grain yields, we're seeing lower yields, but in our system where we do double crop with soybeans, they may increase soybean yields or decrease depending on the varieties. Obviously, our specialty corn varieties or heirloom varieties do have a lot lower yield potential. And so that goes back to the pricing and needing to negotiate those prices accordingly to adjust for these lower conventional yields. And so for those interested in, we have enterprise budgets available for specialty grains at our Ag Econ at University of Kentucky website budget page. So those are available, and everything you see in blue can be changed. So thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.